You can tell when it starts to happen because the room gets quieter, but your mind gets louder. You are sitting there with your phone in your hand, staring at a screen that has not changed, and somehow your body still acts as if a message might arrive if you wait long enough. Not because you believe it will save you, not because you are naive, but because somewhere inside you, a part of you still thinks that if you explain it one more time, if you choose the right words, if you soften the edges just enough, the distance will finally make sense. And that is the strange exhaustion nobody talks about. It is not only the pain of being unheard, it is the pain of having to keep translating your own heart into a language that someone else refuses to learn. After a while, explaining stops feeling like communication. It starts feeling like self-erasure. You begin to notice how often you are editing your own truth before you speak it, how often you are making your feelings smaller so they will fit inside someone else's comfort, how often you are turning your own needs into a carefully wrapped package so they do not sound too much, too sensitive, or too demanding. And if you have lived like that for years, silence can feel terrifying at first, because silence removes the only tool you thought you had. No more clarifying, no more defending, no more long messages sent at midnight with your heart in them. No more explaining the same wound in a different tone, hoping this time it lands. At first, silence feels like loss. Then, if you stay with it long enough, it begins to feel like air. That is the part most people do not understand. Silence is not always punishment. Sometimes it is not withdrawal. Sometimes it is the first honest thing your nervous system has done in years. Because explaining can become a survival strategy. You explain when you are trying to keep the peace. You explain when you are afraid of being misunderstood. You explain when you have learned that your emotions only count if they are made acceptable. You explain when you believe that if you can just be clear enough, patient enough, compassionate enough, the other person will finally meet you halfway. But there comes a point where explanation stops being a bridge and becomes a trap. You keep building a bridge to someone who never learns how to cross it. And the more you build, the more you disappear into the labor of being understood. This is where the deeper truth begins. What hurts is not only that they do not listen. What hurts is that you have been trained to treat your own inner reality as negotiable. You learn to stand at the edge of your own feeling and ask permission to have it. That kind of pattern does not appear out of nowhere. It usually has roots, early roots, old roots. Roots in the places where you had to become easy to manage in order to remain close to someone. Roots in the moments where your truth was inconvenient, where your needs were met with irritation, dismissal, or emotional absence. Roots in the quiet conclusion a child makes when they do not yet have words for it. If I explain better, maybe I will be safe. If I stay calm enough, maybe I will be loved. If I make myself understandable, maybe I will not be left. Carl Jung would call this the world of complexes, those emotionally charged knots in the psyche that keep repeating themselves until they are seen. A complex is not just a memory, it is a living pattern. It gets activated, and suddenly you are not only reacting to the person in front of you, you are reacting to every moment in your life when being heard felt like a struggle. That is why silence can feel so dangerous at first. Not because it is empty, but because it removes the old performance. When you stop explaining, you are no longer feeding the role of the one who must make everything understandable. You are no longer volunteering for the emotional job of managing other people's reactions. And if that role has been part of your identity for a long time, its disappearance can feel like grief. You may even feel guilty. That guilt is important, not because it means you are doing something wrong, but because it reveals how deeply your persona was built around being available. The persona is the face we learn to wear in order to belong. Sometimes it is the helpful one, the understanding one, the patient one, the one who never makes things awkward, the one who can handle more than anyone else because they always have, the one who explains, absorbs, smooths, forgives, and tries again. From the outside, that persona can look like strength. From the inside, it can feel like a cage. Because if you have been the person who explains for long enough, you may no longer know where your true boundary begins. You may not know the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. You may not know when your kindness is genuine and when it is simply fear wearing a soft face. And here is the uncomfortable part. Sometimes silence becomes medicine, not because the other person changes, but because you stop participating in the part of the dynamic that was slowly draining your soul. That is a very different thing. It is not a trick. It is not a tactic. It is not a way to make someone panic and come back. It is the moment you stop feeding the emotional machine that required your constant explanation. When you have spent years translating your pain for someone who only heard what was convenient, silence feels like rebellion at first. But it is not rebellion in the childish sense. It is a return to the place inside you that knows your truth does not need to be argued into existence. This is where Carl Jung becomes important in a real way, not as decoration, but as a lens. Because Jung understood something modern life forgets. What we do over and over is often not just a choice. It is a pattern shaped by the unconscious. And the unconscious does not care how intelligent you are, how self-aware you think you are, or how many times you promise yourself this will be the last time. If there is an old wound that says, "Keep explaining or you will be abandoned," then every silence from the other person can trigger a deeper panic. Not just about them, about your own worth. So you speak again, and again, and again. Not because you are weak, because a part of you is trying to prevent an old loss. But the unconscious is clever. It can disguise repetition as hope. You think you are trying to save the relationship. Sometimes you are actually trying to save the younger part of yourself that never got to be heard the first time. That is why the body reacts so strongly when you finally stop. The chest tightens. The hands want to reach for the phone. The mind says, maybe one more message, maybe one more explanation. Maybe if I make it softer, they will understand what I meant. And then, if you stay still long enough, something else begins to happen. The silence does not feel empty anymore. It starts to feel honest. Because you notice that every time you explained, you were not only speaking to them, you were also trying to convince yourself that this connection still had dignity. You were trying to preserve meaning. You were trying to keep the story from collapsing into what it already was. That is a hard thing to admit, especially if you are someone who has always been the one who sees potential, the one who understands nuance, the one who gives the benefit of the doubt, the one who can explain away distance, inconsistency, emotional immaturity, mixed signals, or a pattern of disappearing and returning as if nothing happened. There is a kind of intelligence that can become dangerous when it is used against your own instincts. You begin to interpret every silence. You begin to translate every delay. You begin to make excuses for emotional absence because you can imagine all the reasons someone might be afraid, overwhelmed, confused, or closed off. And yes, sometimes those reasons are real, but understanding someone's wound does not mean you have to keep offering yours. That is the line. Silence becomes medicine when it stops being a performance and becomes a boundary. A boundary is not a wall. It is not cruelty. It is not the coldness of someone who no longer cares. A real boundary says, I can feel compassion without volunteering for harm. I can understand your limitation without making it my responsibility. I can care without chasing. I can love without explaining myself into exhaustion. This is where the shadow enters the room, because many people think the shadow is only the dark, aggressive, unacceptable part of the psyche. But sometimes, the shadow also contains the truth we avoid, because it would force us to change our role. If you have been the explainer, your shadow may contain anger you were never allowed to show. It may contain the part of you that is tired of being reasonable. It may contain the part that wants to say, I have said enough. It may contain the part that no longer wants to be available to confusion, dressed up as intimacy. And if you have been taught that anger is dangerous, you may have spent years converting it into extra patience, extra softness, extra understanding. That conversion can look noble. It can also be self-betrayal. Because when anger is not allowed to become a clean boundary, it often becomes fatigue, resentment, numbness, emotional collapse. The body starts carrying what the mouth will not say. That is why silence can feel medicinal, not because it makes you passive, because it finally gives your nervous system a break from the constant work of emotional translation. Imagine a room where you have been standing for years, holding up a conversation that only one person is really having. You are doing all the labor. You are carrying the meaning. You are making the bridge. You are supplying the hope. You are supplying the repair. You are supplying the emotional grammar. At some point, your body says no more. And that no more is not a tantrum. It is wisdom. It is the moment your psyche begins to understand that not every connection deserves your explanation, and not every silence deserves your panic. There is another layer here that many people miss. Sometimes the person who keeps asking you to explain yourself is not actually asking for clarity. They are asking for access. Access to your energy, your attention, your emotional labor, your willingness to keep the loop alive. That is why some dynamics become so addictive. Not because they are loving, but because they are unfinished. The mind keeps trying to resolve what the heart keeps hoping will change, and every explanation becomes another turn in the labyrinth. Jung used images like the labyrinth and the mirror to describe inner confusion for a reason. The labyrinth is what it feels like when you are walking in circles inside the same emotional structure. The mirror is what it feels like when you keep looking at another person to understand yourself, only to discover that the reflection keeps changing with your mood. If you have spent years explaining, you may have been standing in that labyrinth, thinking the exit is one more conversation. But the exit is often not more language. Sometimes the exit is the end of the performance. Sometimes the exit is the moment you stop handing your inner life to someone who treats it like a debate. And this can be especially painful for empathic people, because empathic people are often told they are too sensitive, when, in reality, they are simply more aware of emotional undercurrents than the people around them. They notice tone, shift, tension, avoidance, and contradiction. They feel the room before anyone says a word. They can sense when something is off. That sensitivity is a gift, but without boundaries, it becomes a wound. Because if you can feel everything, you may also become the one who takes responsibility for everything. You may become the emotional weather system for the whole relationship. If they are distant, you try harder. If they are cold, you become warmer. If they withdraw, you explain. If they are confused, you clarify. If they are silent, you fill the silence. And somewhere in that pattern, your own center gets lost. Silence becomes medicine when it brings you back to your center. Not the silence of punishment, the silence of self-respect. The silence that says, I am no longer available to overfunction in a connection that under-reciprocates. This is where the body begins to tell the truth before the mind does. You may notice that once you stop explaining, your shoulders drop, your jaw unclenches, your stomach settles, you sleep differently, you stop rehearsing conversations in the shower, you stop writing paragraphs in your head that no one asked for, you stop living in the next reply, the next apology, the next chance to be understood. That is not emotional coldness. That is your system leaving survival mode. For years, maybe you thought your constant explaining was love. But love does not require you to shrink your own reality until it is painless for someone else to hear. Love does not ask you to become a translator for your own wounds. Love does not require you to keep proving that your pain is real. The deeper truth is that explanation can become a form of hope addiction. You keep hoping that if they finally understand, the hurt will make sense. If they understand, the closeness will return. If they understand, the distance will stop. If they understand, the story will be redeemed. But understanding is not the same as change. And sometimes the biggest relief comes when you stop confusing those two things. This is where the ego comes in. The ego wants continuity. It wants to preserve the story of who you have been in the relationship. It wants to believe that if you keep doing what you have always done, the outcome will eventually improve. The ego hates uncertainty. It would rather keep explaining forever than face the grief of not being met. But the self, in Jungian language, is deeper than the ego. The self is the organizing center of the whole psyche, the part that moves toward wholeness even when the ego clings to familiar pain. The self does not always protect comfort. Sometimes it protects truth. And truth can be quiet. Truth can arrive as fatigue. Truth can arrive as a sudden refusal to write the message. Truth can arrive as a simple sentence. I am done explaining what should have been clear by now. That sentence may feel harsh at first if your old identity was built around being understandable. But sometimes, clarity sounds harsh to the part of us that has survived through accommodation. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere tonight. Not a speech, not an explanation, just one honest line. Because the moment you can name the pattern, it starts to lose some of its power. And the pattern is often this. You explain, they receive just enough to keep you engaged, and then nothing really changes. You explain again, hoping this time the meaning will stick. But each cycle teaches your body a painful lesson. Your truth must be repeatedly defended to be allowed to exist. That lesson is corrosive. It teaches you to doubt your own inner weather. It teaches you to treat your intuition as a negotiable opinion. It teaches you to wait for external validation before you trust what you already know. Silence interrupts that education. Silence says, I no longer need to audition for my own reality. That is why it can feel like medicine. Not because it heals everything instantly, but because it stops the bleeding. And there is another reason silence matters so much after years of explaining. It removes the illusion of control. When you are explaining, you feel active, productive, hopeful. You feel like you are doing something. Silence can feel like doing nothing, but often what we call doing something is just our fear dressed as effort. We keep talking because we think language can control emotional outcomes. We keep clarifying because we think if the message is clear enough, the person will respond correctly. We keep explaining because silence forces us to face the possibility that the issue was never misunderstanding alone. Sometimes the issue was willingness. Sometimes it was capacity. Sometimes it was emotional immaturity. Sometimes it was a persona built to avoid vulnerability. Sometimes it was a complex that made intimacy feel threatening. Sometimes it was a pattern in which your openness became the place where someone else hid from themselves. That is a hard thing to see when you love someone. It is even harder when you have invested years in being the one who could make it better. But the moment you see it, the spell weakens. Because then silence is no longer emptiness. It is discernment. You begin to feel the difference between a connection that is quiet because it is safe and a connection that is quiet because it is avoiding truth. You begin to recognize when your nervous system is peaceful and when it is simply waiting in a familiar state of alertness. You begin to notice that some forms of longing are not love at all. They are attachment wounds looking for a familiar shape. Carl Jung would have called that projection in its emotional form. We project not only fantasies onto people, but unfinished inner material. We project the hope of being chosen, the fear of being left, the image of the one who will finally understand, the fantasy of the person who will heal what was never healed in us. That is why silence can be so revealing. When the other person is gone, or when you stop reaching, what remains is not only absence. What remains is the shape of your own longing. And that shape can teach you more than 100 conversations ever did. Because maybe you are not only grieving them, maybe you are grieving the version of yourself that kept believing explanation would be enough. Maybe you are grieving the years spent trying to earn basic emotional reciprocity. Maybe you are grieving the tenderness you gave to a situation that did not know how to hold it. Maybe you are grieving the self you had to become in order to stay. That grief is real. Let it be real. But do not confuse grief with failure. Grief is what arrives when the psyche finally stops pretending. It is the sound of the old attachment loosening its grip. It is the cost of seeing clearly after a long time in a blur. And then, almost quietly, a new question begins to emerge. Not, how do I explain this better? Not, how do I get them to understand? Not, what should I say so they finally see? But, why was I so willing to keep explaining to someone who benefited from my uncertainty? That question changes everything, because now the focus shifts from their silence to your participation in the loop. Not to blame you, to free you. You were not stupid, you were not weak. You were loyal in a way that became costly. You were hopeful in a way that became dangerous. You were compassionate in a way that needed boundaries. There is a difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. There is a difference between patience and erasure. There is a difference between loving someone and making yourself smaller so they can tolerate your love. Silence becomes medicine when it helps you feel those differences in your bones. At first, the old reflex will return. You will want to send the message. You will want to smooth the tension. You will want to explain why you pulled back, why you were hurt, why the distance matters, why this is not what you meant, why you are not angry, why you are simply tired. And maybe you will send it once, maybe you will not. But eventually, if you stay with the silence, you will notice something astonishing. The world does not end because you stopped over-explaining. Your worth does not vanish because you stopped narrating it. The relationship does not become more real because you keep chasing clarity. And your body, which has been carrying the strain of emotional overwork, begins to breathe as if it has been waiting for this permission all along. That is the medicine. Not the fantasy that silence will force someone to change. The reality that silence gives you back your own mind. Because when you stop explaining, you start hearing yourself again. You hear the part of you that was tired of being interrupted. You hear the part of you that knew the answer before you had words for it. You hear the part of you that was not asking for perfection, only mutuality. You hear the part of you that does not want to be managed, analyzed, minimized, or kept on a leash of half-understanding. And once you hear that part, it becomes harder to abandon it. That is individuation in the simplest sense. Not becoming superior, not becoming detached from all feeling, not becoming cold. Individuation is the slow, sometimes painful process of becoming less split inside yourself. It is when you stop living entirely through the role that once kept you safe and begin to live from a deeper center. For the empath, this often means learning that being open is not the same as being available to everyone. For the habitual explainer, it means learning that clarity does not require overexposure. For the person who has always tried to keep peace, it means learning that peace built on self-silencing is not peace at all. It is postponement. And postponement has a cost. The cost is your nervous system. The cost is your dignity. The cost is the part of you that slowly starts to disappear when you keep making room for someone who never makes room for you. Silence interrupts the postponement. It says, enough, not enough love, enough self-abandonment, and that distinction matters. Because when you finally stop explaining, you may discover that what you were calling communication was actually begging for basic emotional safety. You may discover that what you were calling patience was fear of loss. You may discover that what you were calling understanding was a refusal to admit that the pattern had already told you what you needed to know. That realization can sting, but it also cleans the lens. And once the lens is clean, you can see the relationship more honestly, not as a battlefield, not as a test, not as a puzzle you failed to solve, just as a living pattern that either supports your wholeness or drains it. That is where maturity begins, not in dramatic exits, not in revenge, not in proving who cared more. Maturity begins when you can sit in the silence without trying to turn it into a message, when you can feel the ache without turning it into a chase, when you can remember the person without reopening the wound, when you can let the unanswered question remain unanswered, because your life is no longer organized around forcing an answer from the wrong place. There is a particular kind of peace that comes after this. It is not loud, it is not euphoric. It is the peace of no longer needing to perform emotional labor just to preserve access. And if you are still in the middle of it, if your hand still reaches for the phone, if your mind still builds conversations that never happen, do not shame yourself. That is just the old pattern trying one more time to survive. But you are allowed to outgrow survival. You are allowed to stop translating your pain for people who only hear what suits them. You are allowed to let silence do what explanations never could. You are allowed to let your own boundary become the place where your life begins to feel like yours again. And if you are wondering what happens next, the answer is simpler than the old fear wanted it to be. You become harder to manipulate through confusion. You become less available to emotional loops. You become less willing to confuse intensity with intimacy. You become more sensitive to the difference between being understood and being used. You become someone who can feel deeply without leaking yourself everywhere. That is not coldness. That is refinement. That is the soul learning where to stop. So let the phone stay quiet for a moment. Let the room be what it is. Let the unfinished message remain unfinished. Let the explanation rest. You do not have to keep speaking just because silence once scared you. Sometimes silence is not the absence of love. Sometimes it is the end of self-betrayal. And when you finally feel that, even for a second, you will understand why it became medicine. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Say that softly, not as a slogan, but as a return. Because the silence you feared may be the first place where your own voice can finally be heard.